The Spinoff Podcast Network.
Are you making the most of your KiwiSaver investment? Generate is an award-winning KiwiSaver provider with a track record of strong long-term performance. Making a smart decision now could add tens of thousands of dollars by the time you reach retirement. Book a no-obligation chat with a Generate KiwiSaver advisor today at generatekiwisaver.co.nz/get-advice. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, a podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
Most radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the Fourth Labour Government, made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on the Spinoff or wherever you get your podcasts. No mai, haere mai, welcome to Gone by Lunchtime. I'm Toby Manhire, and I have here with me at the Spinoff Annabelle Lee. Hi Annabelle, you're just choking on an M&M there. Mm-hmm. How have you been?
I've been very well.
We missed you last time, a fortnight ago, owing to something to do with your day job.
I had to have a hui.
Oh, you had a hui?
I had a hui.
And instead we had Guy Williams in the Spinoff studio.
He was wonderful.
And he schooled us on a few things, didn't he, Ben Thomas from Exceltium? Hi.
It was a wild time. It was I think by decibel the loudest episode, not just of this podcast, maybe any. And Madeline Chapman, who is producer today, has given us very clear instructions following Guy Williams tutoring us on some weird rule about not eating. And what was your instruction, Mad? She'll have to shout because you won't be able to hear it.
Chew loudly.
Chew loudly, says Matt. So we are going to defy the instructions of Guy, tall comedian Williams, and chew loudly through the episode. If you don't like that, you go and listen to go and listen to Jono and Ben or whatever.
We're eating green M&Ms though.
He's a good guy though. It was good to have him on.
It was good. It was good. It was interesting. But we missed you, Annabelle.
I missed you guys too.
You, when oh, this is beautiful. Let's wrap it up there. When I asked you guys what you wanted to talk about, you said you wanted to talk about the new Fairfax podcast, Black Hands. That's been obsessing you over the recent days.
It's like making a murderer, but the New Zealand version. And the good thing is that I can still listen to it and yell at my kids and perform mundane tasks and that instead of just staring into the television for 10 hours.
Does your house in many ways resemble 65 Every Street, Dunedin?
Well, like Margaret, I would love to be able to go to bed for 6 weeks at a time. So it sort of inspired me in that regard. But otherwise, not a whole lot of similarities between my whare and the Bain house. Others may beg to differ.
The podcast about David Bain, or the Bain family killings a zillion years ago, which Martin van Banyan has disinterred. Have you been listening?
It's sort of like the opposite of Serial, isn't it? Instead of kind of cloaked in ambiguity and unanswered questions, it's sort of everybody knows who the killer was, and now we're just going to go over it one more time in great depth.
To be fair, I think he plays it with a fairly straight bat. I mean, clearly he believes that it's David and he says so, but he, doesn't shy away from calling out the police on their shoddy work and, entertains the possibility that it is Robin and admits that there is nothing that is absolutely damning, so...
When I was in Parliament, you'd get a lot of alternative theories presented to you by concerned members of the public. One which I think I can probably share because it wasn't sent to my boss directly. Yeah. Parliamentary Security got a box of 500 self-published books called The Road to Innocent, which the entirety, it looked like one of those kind of fancy real estate catalogues that, is about sort of 48 pages long or something, kind of glossy A4. And it was entirely composed of scanned copies of correspondence with the author from various officials, lawyers, parties to the case, politely rejecting his offer of assistance to prove that it was the youngest daughter who was the killer.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
We're going to devote the rest of the podcast this year to elaborating and stringing out that theory. Also, Ben, before we actually start this podcast proper, you were just relating a moment ago your experience on One News with your latest promiscuous approach to the political media. Could you tell us that story again for the listeners?
I mean, it was a proud moment. It was the first time I ever appeared on media that my grandmother would see. So probably the high point of the Thomas family lineage.
And how did it go?
It didn't go so well. I haven't cut my hair in a while, and because I suffer from male pattern baldness, whenever my hair gets a bit sort of too long, it sort of becomes a bit sort of Christopher Lloyd-ish in Back to the Future, and it wasn't my finest moment.
I think it's fetching.
I like it too. I like the flux capacitor. The look. The most of the political attention, I suppose, in the last kind of week and a bit has been around Metiria Turei, who's the co-leader of the Green Party, and her at their AGM, I think they call it, don't they? Their conference.
Yeah.
She, as part of an announcement of policy around welfare, she said that when she was in her 20s or 23 or something, she had flatmates or boarders which she hadn't declared to Winz, thereby misleading Winz, and so committed benefit fraud. And that's been interesting because it's I don't know if they expected it to play out like this, but it's really. She said this morning on national radio that it had cracked open the conversation on whether it's possible to live on a benefit, and it has done that, Annabelle, hasn't it? I mean, it's also divided people about the rights or wrong of it and whether or not should be forced to pay it back or whatever.
It has. For me personally, I was quite pleased when she made that announcement, just because. Sorry, Guy.
Is that an M&M? It's an M&M. Again, see, Guy is right.
It's
Guy is very much with us.
It's sugary saliva that builds up around an M&M, and
Thank you for that detail.
Yeah, viscous and hard to swallow.
Yeah.
Anyway, last year I went to a Bruce Jesson memorial lecture, which was delivered by Dr. Lisa Marriott, and I literally sat there slack-jawed at her research, which is on the difference between the way the state treats welfare fraud compared to tax evasion. And just those two names alone kind of sums up the whole approach. Welfare fraud versus tax evasion. So I've been looking for an opportunity to have Lisa on the show, and that, Metiria's announcement, I think, sort of opened the door to that. And it's on the News Hub website if you want to go watch it, people. It's really interesting. Have a look. Yeah, it's quite compelling. $1.2 billion worth of tax evasion every year versus $30 million worth of welfare fraud. But, we chase down welfare fraudsters to the ends of the earth. They're more likely to be prosecuted, more likely to be jailed, and most welfare fraud is paid back, albeit over a very long period of time, whereas tax fraud, tax evasion, tax fraud is the opposite.
Nevertheless, Metiria Turei has confessed to breaking the law and, arguably stealing public money. Is that not something that should give people pause about her credentials for becoming, say, a minister in a future government?
I think that some of the outrage that we've seen come from other members of Parliament is slightly hypocritical, because arguably, not that I'm encouraging anyone to break the law, and that's certainly not what she was doing either. My read of it was that she was saying this is a position she was put in. It's not how she wants to define herself as a person, but unfortunately a lot of other New Zealanders find themselves in this position. In her case, you could argue it was a crime motivated by desperation rather than greed, and a conversation needs to be had about how we treat welfare recipients and whether or not benefits are enough to live on. Certainly it's done her some damage in some quarters, but I think in other quarters it's probably added to her credibility rather than diminished it. Although obviously it has made her low-hanging fruit for people who already have a strong sense of resentment towards beneficiaries.
What do you think, Ben? Do you think that she's undermined in terms of credibility, legitimacy?
Yes, I think in terms of admitting that she's broken the law, if you actually cast around, you'd be hard-pressed to find many members of Parliament right now who haven't, for instance, admitted to smoking cannabis.
Yes.
Right? Or paying for a cash job for some
yeah, but I think the cannabis one is particularly sort of relevant because now it's almost fashionable.
Yeah, that's right.
Square if you don't
that's true. Yeah.
It was a big change from about, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And so I don't think it's quite as straightforward as saying she's admitted to breaking the law so she can't hold a ministerial post. I think she really struggled today on Morning Report, being interviewed by Guy Nespina, talking about what she would do as Minister of Social Development, confronted by people who were defrauding her increased benefits were she to become minister, and where actually do you draw the line in terms of absolute need. Because I think there has been a bit of slipperiness, and this is just in talking about her personal narrative, that initially it was kind of sold as, stopping my child from starving, and today in terms of justifying running for Parliament twice during that time, she said, well, everyone deserves to have fun and deserves to have interests in a life, or, something along those lines. So we're not talking about absolutes, and we still don't actually know enough details to make any kind of judgments on that. What I do think is important is what Annabelle was saying, which is we need to look at, how easy is it actually for people to get support. There's actually huge amounts of money available, and it's increasing all the time with the election sort of bidding process for sole parents, low-income parents. But it is actually increasingly difficult to access those for a lot of people. I think the forms for going on welfare are about 50 pages long, and you almost sort of have to be a middle-class technocrat, middle manager to fill these in properly. And in the last week, there's been discussion about whether there are targets for caseworkers to get people off benefits. Well, there are clearly targets to get people into work, and Winz would dispute that they're trying to stop people from accessing benefits, but you'd be hard-pressed to say that that's not a factor.
Yeah.
You're exactly right, and in my job that's something that we hear over and over and over again, and on Sunday we put a story to air about grandparents who, for whatever reason, are having to raise their grandchildren, and all of them say the most difficult thing is trying to navigate their way through the Winz system. They're elderly, they're on fixed incomes, they're living in little 2-bedroom units, and suddenly they find themselves caring for 4 mokopuna, and the state is not forthcoming about what resources are available. Just going back to the Metiria thing and running for Magilakari Serious and legalising Aotearoa, I'm a little bit confused about why this has become an issue, because are we saying that people on benefits are not allowed to be politically active? Are we saying, and then what's the next step from that? So if you're not allowed to stand for Parliament, does that mean that beneficiaries should not be allowed to vote? Because to be fair, she was raising a child on her own and putting herself through law school. That's a lot of hard work. I think the fact that actually she found time to be politically active is something that's admirable, rather than something we should all feel astonished and aggrieved about. Myself, I just think it's a slippery slope, because what does that say? Beneficiaries aren't allowed to run for Parliament.
Running for Parliament is a big investment in time and actually, in a lot of cases, resources.
For Magilakari Serious and for legalise Aotearoa.
Well, I think her response to that, because most people's perception of the Magilakari Serious Party is that it is as much. It's not exactly kind of a serious bid for power, is it? So I think that her defence of that was, well, you're allowed to have fun too when you're a beneficiary, and I think that probably goes to the sort of talkback radio perception, or the idea is that if you're on welfare, you need to be at home, like
living a monastic lifestyle.
Yeah, subsistent and kind of digging up potatoes from your backyard.
Which,
and all that.
to be fair, was a narrative that was kind of put about by a lot of supporters, particularly online, that this was a real hand-to-mouth, scrabbling for sort of subsistence survival sort of story in the early parts of, when this kind of first was announced, or, first came to light in her speech. So I think it just clashes with the narrative, and I think that was why, it's received attention, because I think everyone already knew that she'd been a candidate.
And I mean, the interview you mentioned with Guy Nespiner on One Report, she did acknowledge that those were questions she needed to answer, and she said at one point, I need to go back through the records to look at her own. So I think she's kind of acknowledges that it's now become a kind of election issue. I mean, the other thing that's interesting in this, in terms of the way it plays in the campaign, is I just pulled up an interview that the Spinoff did with Turei and James Shaw, the other co-leader, sort of towards the start of the year, and they were talking about how in 2014, according to their numbers, they got 1% of media coverage of the campaign. And I mean, I'm not sure on the detail of that, but they said they quote, as for campaigning, we're really committed to not saying crazy shit just for the sake of getting headlines, says James Shaw. And that's always been a problem for them. We saw that in the weeks leading up to this, that it was all New Zealand first, and the Greens sort of who'd positioned themselves so moderately, really, had been straining at it. This gets media cut through. It really has. I mean, whether or not it will yield support in the next opinion polls, but the Greens are there in the front and centre, right?
I think it will. This will resonate with a lot of their supporters, which is, first of all, people who are struggling on benefits, but much more so middle class people who have actually are actually pretty comfortable with a bit of mild system rorting. Everyone I went to university with used their course-related costs to buy a new iPod or a laptop, or go on a holiday, or buy beer. Yeah. So the sort of comfortable middle classes, I think, are actually a lot more sort of at home with what Metiria is talking about than a lot of the working classes, the sort of people who actually, I mean, strange as it is for a glib urban liberal like me, there's a lot of people out there who work hard and are proud of working hard and don't necessarily enjoy their jobs, but take a lot of pride in the fact that they support their families, that they've never been on welfare. I think that it'll hurt the left bloc as a whole with those voters, so I think it'll actually hurt Labour.
I think, as the saying goes, the Greens have always been the bridesmaid and never the bride, and they were kind of staring down the barrel of that again this election with, New Zealand First becoming, more and more influential, and both National and Labour cozying up to them. So they kind of had to pull out a power play, and it's a risky one, but New Zealand politics seems so risk averse at the moment. You can barely differentiate between Labour and National. So I think in terms of appealing to, to the left of New Zealand, to the far left of New Zealand, who perhaps feel somewhat ignored, that it, I can see why they've taken this approach, and whether or not it plays out for them.
One of the things
I'm not sure, but something had to be done, and maybe too it's slightly inspired by Jeremy Corbyn, to be pushing left rather than fighting for the middle ground where you've got a whole lot of parties scrapping already.
I found it really interesting that the Green policy of raising core benefits by 20%, which was actually sort of at the heart of their announcement, has been described as radical and removing work testing requirements was radical. Now, this was the status quo not too long ago.
Similarly, putting the top tax rate up to 40 cents on the dollar,
like really
the idea
extremist,
above $150,000. The idea that a Labour Party would oppose that is kind of amazing.
And then the ACT Party, standard disclaimer, did a bit of work for them earlier this year. Their number 2, Beth Holbrook, who nobody had sort of heard of before, came out and said, you shouldn't have kids if you can't afford it. And this was greeted with online cries of sort of eugenics. And I mean, this is an utterly respectable, just sort of truism to most middle New Zealand during the 90s, the 2000s. And similarly, you wouldn't find anybody in the 90s or 2000s who would have described putting up benefits as a radical position. And yet, because the two major parties have just intertwined on this sort of nightmare mishmash of sort of fake tax credits and sort of abatement rates and sort of fudging the line between welfare and work, and these sort of weird technocratic solutions that...
Who's that?
That's his grandmother. She's just ringing to say she saw him on TV and wants him to get a better suit.
But it's really interesting that the convergence of the two parties on this sort of consensus, this what we could call the working for families model, has actually opened up what used to be just totally the normal left-right kind of contest on welfare is now seen as like really polarizing sort of extremes.
Hey, just while we're on the subject, can I take a moment to fangirl Kim Hill for that interview she did?
Which one?
The one with
the ambassador.
Brooke. Auntie Brooke from ACT. What's her name?
Yes,
Beth Holbrook.
The one who thinks people shouldn't have kids if they haven't got enough money.
I thought that was pretty mainstream and would have resonated with a lot of people. And then I think it went a little off course when she started talking about how poor people should be freezing their embryos.
Good times.
Awkward.
Annabelle, you said you could barely differentiate a lot of the time. You were alluding to that too, Ben, between Labour and National. But Labour have put out their own alternative budget, the main thrust of it, which got a bit lost, I think, in a week that was dominated by the Greens and the Winston First aboard his bus. But they want to borrow a bit more. It's sort of roughly the same course, but it's clear enough. They want to borrow a bit more, pay down debt more slowly. That they would spend that money on health, number one, on education, two, and on putting money into the super fund, number three. Is it now an election which we haven't had all that much of in the last couple of decades, maybe, or 15 years, where there is a clear choice? Is there a clear choice for voters about whether they want money to go into tax cuts and that kind of in your own back pocket versus they think that the state is better to determine some of that redistributively? Again,
it's at the margins. So, we're talking $20 tax cuts versus, more social spending. So it's not this sort of huge lolly scramble like we had in 2005, 2008. I think Labour will be disappointed that they didn't get more media cut through on that budget. They obviously worked very hard on it. Where it will help them for the remaining 8.5 weeks of the campaign is that the coverage was mainly, in fact, the news story on News Hub I saw was Labour's numbers add up. And actually that's not trivial for Labour during campaigns. They've been caught out in the last two campaigns, about what was Key's line?
Show me the money.
Yeah.
Which plays into a perception which is not necessarily borne out empirically, but the perception that the parties of the left tend to be faster and looser with the money, whereas the parties of the centre-right are prudent and
the government of the day has an unfair advantage in this because people just assume that anything they announce can be done because it's being done.
Yeah.
Whereas there's a sort of burden of I think, as you said, unfair burden of proof on opposition parties. And although
we had experiences in the 80s, particularly where opposition parties made all sorts of crazy suggestions and then did very few of them when they went into government. So there's not. I mean, there is reasonable scepticism.
Although a lot of the time that was because they didn't understand the true state of the finances and the government had been lying. So like in 1990, but where this will help Labour is if they can square away at the beginning of this campaign that their numbers do add up. So all the subsequent announcements that they make that flow from that budget people won't be quibbling over the cost or,
Sure.
Is this credible? And that's actually a good thing for them to establish up front, I think.
What do you reckon, Annabelle? I mean, the Greens, going back to them, they spent a lot of time over the last year and a half, two and a half years really, kind of preparing the ground for now by shoring up the business communities and all that with their memorandum of understanding, their budget responsibility rules, all this kind of incredibly earnest promises that they're not wild and crazy. It's okay. We can be trusted. Do you think now that on the left, I mean, we obviously chuck New Zealand First on there, that they are sort of stacking up as a plausible alternative?
I think the problem is that when you do come across as too earnest and too responsible, you're not appealing to the voters who desperately want change, and you're just starting to look like more of the same but a slightly fringe version of it. So again, I think that that's why what we've seen this week from the Greens has been an important move from them. I have to say, just in terms of the stories that we do and the issues that people face, for example, Labor's family package, people already have a hard time navigating their way through Winz, and trying to get some of these tax bonuses or credits or whatever it is that you call them, you just about have to have a master's degree. Certainly it's even more difficult if you live in a car and you don't have an internet connection and you're trying to get on the website to figure out what you're entitled to. So I think there's an appetite for simple policies that people can understand that appear to be easily accessible, and I think that's why we're seeing the Opportunities Party sort of getting some cut through, because they're talking about simple things that make a difference. And just recalling Labor when they announced their student loan policy, for example, interest-free student loans, it's sort of clear, easy stuff that people can grasp. With the family tax package, it's sort of like if you have 3 kids and the 4th one is conceived on the crescent moon in midsummer, you can have half a tax bonus.
If you fill out this form, you'll get a rebate.
Yeah.
In 12 months. Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, and I suspect that Labor will be alert to that, and they will want to have at least one kind of flagship policy in the next. We got 2 months to go until the election, because that student loans interest thing, depending on how you tell the story, swung things.
Oh, absolutely won the 2005 election. I remember when that policy was announced. That was before social media, but that was probably the first viral policy announcement I remember.
Right.
When we were, all in our first desk jobs, everyone would email each other about Labor's announcement for the first day or two. It was that exciting.
Speaking of virality, have you seen the new sort of ads and the billboards and everything? Is everyone hugely excited about that?
I love the way hoardings bring out people's creative streak. I love the little moustaches and the swear words. I thought the Bill English Dominoes delivering to New Zealand was an inspired piece of work. So I'm excited to see them back up. I always think it's interesting who's up and who hasn't got up yet. So like in Ponsonby, Shane Todima, Tamaki Makoto, Māori Party, he's up there, but I haven't seen any Penny
Annabelle Lee
Henare.
has got out there to the Heartland New Zealand Ponsonby.
I have.
This is the heart of
the heart of Te Ao Māori.
My reservation about that Domino's Pizza one is that someone did it in Photoshop, and I'm not sure that should be allowed. I feel as though, I would never endorse or condone anyone to get out there. Yeah, that's right. It's probably someone sitting at home on the DPB with the Photoshop doing get out there, I'm telling you. Get the spray paint. I do not endorse that. Do not do it.
Get some fresh air.
But
get to know people in the community.
Yeah, meet some people.
Organise a gang. You can't pull down a hoarding by yourself.
But isn't that about like upskilling though? Like upskilling our graffiti
night
artist.
courses.
Yeah.
You can get into that, Ben, with your career as
a skilled job force.
we haven't talked. We've hardly talked. Oh no! Wait,
I just wanted to say the billboards. I mean, probably the most striking thing about the billboards going up now is you'd have to say that the printing timetable has saved Andrew Little's leadership of the Labor Party.
Yes.
I think if there were about 2 more weeks till press time, Mr. 5% might be having a few more problems with his caucus.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Anyway, we haven't mentioned Winston Peters barely at all, which is kind of incredible. But his bus keeps on soaring through the regions. The Māori seats promise, sort of, which became a bit kind of muddy. It started off as there's going to be a referendum. New Zealand First will have, I think almost as a bottom line, a referendum on whether or not to retain the Māori seats. Then it became a little unclear whether or not that would just be people who are on the Māori roll get to vote on that. What did you make of all that, Annabelle Lee?
I thought it was a bit of a cock-up, really,
Fake media.
You don't need to get into every skirmish, do you, Winston? I just thought it was silly. Firstly, I was insulted that he hadn't watched the Hui, where Shane Jones clearly stated after he was announced as a candidate for New Zealand First that the Māori seats should remain as long as Māori wanted them to.
And he's on the Māori roll, right?
He's on the Māori roll. I just think it's a high risk. It was an unnecessary risk, in my opinion, because Winston is doing well in the Māori seats, and you risk alienating voters who, although they can't give you your electorate vote, they can party vote for New Zealand First. It's not a hot topic anymore.
Well,
no one really cares about it that much. Māori want the seats. It doesn't impact on
Hobson's Pledge have been raising money, and they're looking for someone to give it to. So maybe it was a play for that. I mean,
and he looked out of step with his own MPs.
It remains National Party policy, does it not?
It is
to remove the Māori seats.
It is National Party policy, but obviously because of their partnership with the Māori Party, they've kind of modified it to we do want to abolish the Māori seats when Māori want to get rid of them.
John Key said when we interviewed him at the Herald sort of interview series before the last election, when he was asked that by Audrey Young, he said that to get rid of the Māori seats would be to risk hikois from hell. I'm not sure if he said hikois. Anyway, that which was probably fair enough, right?
But I think, again, in terms of the sort of convergence on certain issues that we've seen, back in 2008, National, ACT, New Zealand First were all campaigning on getting rid of the Māori seats. So there was obviously seen to be a constituency in favour of that.
Yep.
Now here, because of National's alliance with the Māori Party, that's gone. ACT has moved on to other pastures. They've sort of moved on a bit from the sort of Rodney Hyde days. And so Winston has this all to himself if he wants it. Now, the problem is that he also has his next sort of 2 most important MPs are Ron Mark and then will probably be Shane Jones, both of whom are very deeply enmeshed in Māoridom in their communities. Yeah. And Peter Paraone, who is the chairman of the Waitangi Trust, these are very Māori people. They're not just sort of space fillers on the list. They're important figures in their communities, and there is no way that they will be able to sort of successfully sell this to their people.
So maybe New Zealand First isn't quite a one-man party after all.
I just think if Winston feels so strongly about it, perhaps what he should do is on the Sunday after the elections is discount any party vote that New Zealand First receives from the Māori electorates. If you feel so strongly about it, then don't accept the votes that come from those seats.
Bill English put out a press release earlier this morning. We're talking on the 26th of July today, by the way, saying that it was a kind of virtual cup of tea in which he said that the National Party endorses, more or less, David Seymour in Epsom and Peter Dunn in Ohio.
Seismic shockwaves around Wellington.
He didn't mention the Māori Party, but then I think they probably would have preferred he didn't in many ways. But I'm just thinking about that. So we spent a lot of time over recent weeks talking about the putative Labour, Green, New Zealand First, tripartite coalition, how that might work. Do they hate each other? Greens going at New Zealand First going at Greens, Andrew Little going at Winston Peters, etc. But we've applied relatively little attention to the most likely outcome, which is a national New Zealand First government, right? And it was interesting in the House this week, Winston was going hard at Bill English again over the Todd Barclay saga, which we haven't touched on. The vanishing Todd Barclay, who's resigned his candidacy for Cliff Southland. Should we be paying more attention to that? I'm sort of wondering maybe that's going to happen in the time to come. Winston Peters has called for Bill English's resignation. Bill English is in his press conference this week saying, Winston, he talks a lot of claptrap. If that were happening on the other side of the ledger, I think perhaps people would be more alarmed by it. Is this just the game of Winston Peters? What is it?
I think that you can successfully discount pretty much everything Winston says before an election. It makes the punditry and the sort of Kremlinology of it a little less fun when you realise that there's not actually any way of reading between the lines, because nothing that Winston says. It's not
reading between the lines; it's reading the lines.
There's. Winston campaigned in 1996 on changing the government, and what he meant was changing the national government to a national New Zealand First government. You can't draw a line, but he rejected the baubles of office in 2005 and then became foreign minister. You can't draw a direct line between statements he makes about politicians or parties, or about where he's going to go in government, or how he's going to deal with people in government. He said terrible things about Jim Bolger, and Jim Bolger said terrible things about him before 1996's election.
Yeah,
and then they actually worked together reasonably well before Bolger was toppled by Shipley, and Peters sacked. So I think that especially a guy like Bill English, the Prime Minister, who's been in Parliament since 1990, with Winston. This is water off a duck's back. He knows that Winston is not going to not going to demand that he resigns as part of his coalition negotiations. I think it might have been different if it was John Key. I think because of the real sort of slight on Winston from 2008 of ruling out working with him, and drawing a connection between Peters' behaviour and honesty and ruling him out, I think that might have been a bit more of an impediment.
It's like a rom-com. This is the bit in the rom-com where the girl pretends that she hates the boy, but really she is harbouring feelings that she can't even admit to herself.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Or like if it was like Taming of the Shrew, if it were speaking in Shakespearean terms.
Which is the shrew? Who's the shrew?
Winston.
Winston is the shrew. That's good. I'm sure you're going to have a lot of success getting him onto your program now if he's listening this deep into this essential podcast. I should say, just because Black Hands, which you mentioned, did explain to their readers helpfully this week that this is a podcast, and they explained that podcast is a portmanteau of iPod and broadcast. So just for anyone that wasn't clear on that, that's what this is too. It's gone by lunchtime. Like us or love us or whatever you do, leave a review on iTunes. I have to say that every time. We were going to get to housing and immigration. We didn't have time, but we'll do that next week. There's lots more to talk about. Thanks, Annabelle.
Thanks, Toby.
Really good to have you back.
It was great to be back.
Thanks,
Missed
Ben.
you guys.
It's always good to see you. Thanks, Mad.
Thanks, Mad.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spinoff. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spinoff member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spinoff Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.